What happens when a fact is witnessed, measured, even recorded, and still left standing outside the gates of belief? History is full of moments like that. A strange light over a quiet valley. A signal crossing the dark from somewhere beyond sight. A sound heard by thousands, yet treated as though it belongs to no one. Again and again, people encounter something that does not fit the map they have been given. And just as often, the first mystery is not the phenomenon itself, but the silence that follows. Science, at its best, is a language of humility. It begins with attention. It asks us to look carefully, doubt honestly, and resist the comfort of easy answers. But science is also a human institution, shaped by funding, reputation, habit, and fear of error. That does not make it false. It makes it vulnerable to the same pressures that shape every other human endeavor. Sometimes what cannot yet be explained is studied with patience. Sometimes it is set aside. And sometimes it is quietly treated as if it were never worth noticing at all. This story lives in that uneasy space between evidence and acceptance. It is not a case for superstition, nor a plea to believe every extraordinary claim. It is something more complicated and perhaps more intimate. It is a journey through phenomena that linger at the edges of explanation, where testimony meets instrumentation, where curiosity meets resistance, and where the unknown reveals as much about us as it does about the world. Across oceans, deserts, laboratories, forests, and distant skies, the same question returns in different forms. Not simply what is happening, but why do some mysteries become doors while others are sealed shut? In the end, the deeper story may not be about hidden forces at all. It may be about the fragile boundary between knowledge and permission, and about what humanity is willing to see only when it is ready. What if the oldest scientific instrument is not a machine, but a human eye turned upward in fear and wonder? Long before laboratories, people studied the world by watching it. They tracked the movement of stars, the return of seasons, the shape of storms. So when something appeared in the sky that did not belong to the known order of things, it entered memory with unusual force. Not because it was proof of another world, but because it disturbed the one already understood. In one generation, the unexplained arrives as a glow above a mountain ridge. In another, it becomes an object caught for a moment on radar, a brief interruption in a pilot's practiced sense of distance and speed. These accounts are often passed around as curiosities, flattened into spectacle or skepticism. Yet behind every report is a quieter human scene. Someone trained to observe, someone startled by what they cannot place, someone discovering that certainty can vanish in a single glance. The problem is not that the sky produces mysteries. It always has. The deeper tension begins when observation outpaces explanation. Institutions built to protect rigor become cautious, and sometimes that caution hardens into avoidance. Data that cannot be repeated on command is treated as weak. Testimony, however sincere, becomes suspect. The unexplained is not disproven. It is simply left waiting in a kind of intellectual weather, exposed to ridicule, speculation, and time. And still, people keep looking up. That may be the most revealing part of all. We are creatures drawn to patterns, but also to interruption. We want a world that can be trusted, yet we are moved by hints that it is larger than our categories. In the sky, mystery often arrives without warning and leaves without conclusion. Perhaps that is why it unsettles us so deeply. It does not merely challenge what we know. It reminds us how much of knowledge begins as a moment no one is ready to name. It started, as many enduring mysteries do, with a signal. Not a voice, not a revelation, just a pattern strong enough to interrupt the ordinary flow of observation. In the controlled quiet of an observatory where machines listen more patiently than people can, something arrives from the dark with a structure that feels almost intentional. For a few seconds or minutes, the universe seems to clear its throat. Then the sound is gone, leaving behind a record, a reaction, and a question too large for the room that first contained it. Signals like these hold a special power because they belong to the language of science itself. They are measurable. They can be graphed, time-stamped, compared, and yet a signal without repetition is a strange kind of evidence. It is precise but lonely. It invites theory but refuses confirmation. Researchers can spend years returning to the same coordinates, rebuilding the same conditions, hoping the cosmos might repeat itself out of courtesy. Usually, it does not. This is where wonder becomes disciplined frustration. The public often imagines discovery as a clean moment of triumph, but much of research is built around ambiguity that never resolves. A signal from nowhere might be interference. It might be a natural phenomenon not yet understood. It might be an artifact of the instruments themselves, or something genuinely rare, moving through a universe more active and intricate than expected. Each possibility carries its own humility. None offers the immediate comfort of certainty, and still, the memory of the event persists, not because it proves anything final, but because it reveals how thin the line can be between noise and meaning. We live surrounded by messages we know how to read: speech, numbers, weather, music, code. But every so often, the world offers a pattern that seems to lean toward us and then withdraw. Perhaps the ache of such moments comes from their familiarity. They resemble all the unanswered things in human life: a call missed, a sentence unfinished, a sign glimpsed too late to understand. What if the Earth remembers what the human record forgets? In remote stretches of desert, on frozen plains, beneath layers of rock and ice, there are marks that do not easily explain themselves. A crater without a witness. A field of glass fused by heat no fire should have produced. Metals bent, magnetized, or displaced in patterns that seem to preserve an event long after its cause has vanished. These are not stories passed from mouth to mouth. They are traces, physical and silent, waiting for interpretation. The difficulty is that evidence in the ground rarely speaks in a single voice. One formation can suggest impact, eruption, pressure, or accident, depending on who studies it and what tools they bring. Geology is patient, but patience does not guarantee agreement. The deeper the mystery, the more explanation must compete with imagination. Some investigators see rare natural events. Others suspect missing pieces in the official account of what happened there. Between them lies a landscape shaped not only by heat and force, but by uncertainty itself. There is something deeply unsettling about material clues that survive their own meaning. Scar in the earth can outlast language, empire, and memory. By the time we discover it, the event may have no surviving eyewitness, no written account, no living tradition to place it in context. We arrive late, carrying instruments and hypotheses, trying to reconstruct a vanished moment from fragments that never expected to be read. In that sense, science can feel less like conquest than like archaeology of silence. And maybe that is why these sites continue to draw us. They suggest that truth is not always hidden because someone buried it. Sometimes it is hidden because time is vast, and memory is small. The planet keeps its own archive, written in pressure, ash, and shattered stone. We learn to read a little of it, then stop at the edge of what can be known. The mystery is not only what happened there, it is how much of reality may have already occurred beyond the reach of human witness, leaving only a wound in the ground and a question in the mind. It begins with a sound no one can hold, a low pulse across the ocean, a hum over distant hills, a sudden concussion in the air that rattles windows, startles birds, and sends people out of their homes looking for a source that is never found. Sound is among the most intimate of mysteries because it enters the body before it becomes language. We do not simply hear it. We feel it in the ribs, the jaw, the skin. By the time the mind asks what it was, the moment has already become unease. There have always been reports of noises that seem to arrive from nowhere and belong to nothing visible. Some are eventually traced to shifting ice, underwater pressure waves, aircraft, industry, or the hidden acoustics of landscape itself, but not all are resolved so neatly. A few remain, suspended between explanation and folklore, recorded by instruments in one place, remembered only by testimony in another. The challenge is not that sound is unreal, it is that sound is fleeting, and once it passes, it leaves behind only witnesses, measurements, and doubt. For scientists, that makes such events difficult terrain. A sound that cannot be summoned again on demand resists the normal machinery of proof. Theories multiply in the vacuum left by repetition. Atmospheric anomalies, tectonic strain, military tests, distant storms, mechanical echoes carried farther than expected. Each answer explains part of the map, but not always the territory of human experience. What remains is a familiar imbalance. The event is vivid to those who heard it, but strangely insubstantial to everyone else. And yet these invisible disturbances linger in memory with unusual force. Perhaps because sound, more than sight, reminds us that reality is not limited to what can be seen. We live inside fields of vibration, many of them too vast, too faint, or too complex for ordinary perception. Every now and then, one of those hidden currents brushes against our lives and makes itself known. Then it disappears, leaving behind the oldest question in listening. When the world speaks in a voice we do not recognize, are we hearing a message or only the boundaries of our understanding? What if the strangest discoveries are not found in the sky or buried in stone, but hidden in the ordinary habits of living things? Across forests, coastlines, and open fields, there are moments when animals seem to know something before we do. Birds lift from trees in sudden waves before a tremor. Fish change direction before a disturbance in the water. Dogs pace, whales strand, insects vanish, and entire patterns of movement shift as if the natural world has received a signal too subtle for human senses to detect. We notice these moments most clearly when disaster follows. For centuries, people treated such behavior as instinct, omen, or coincidence. Modern science, more careful with language, has tried to translate these observations into physiology and environment. Animals may sense changes in air pressure, ground vibration, electromagnetic fields, chemical traces, or frequencies below the threshold of human hearing. None of that is mystical. It is simply a reminder that every species lives inside a different version of the same world, tuned to different channels, alert to different warnings. And yet the mystery persists because the evidence is uneven and difficult to standardize. Anecdotes are abundant, but reliable prediction is rare. A dog trembling before an earthquake is unforgettable if the quake arrives, meaningless if it does not. Researchers can document unusual behavior, but linking it cleanly to future events is far more difficult. Once again, the unknown resists becoming a stable system. It remains a pattern glimpsed at the edge of certainty, suggestive but incomplete. Still, there is something profound in the possibility that other creatures perceive realities we routinely miss, not because they are wiser in any mythic sense, but because they are differently built, differently vulnerable, differently alive. Human knowledge often assumes that better instruments bring us closer to truth. Sometimes they do, but sometimes truth begins with admitting that our own senses are narrow, and that the world may be speaking constantly in registers we were never designed to hear. The question is not only whether animals know more than we do in certain moments. It is what humility asks of us once we accept that intelligence is not the same thing as attention. There are places where the compass hesitates, a valley where radio signals falter, a ridge where navigation drifts by degrees, a stretch of sea or desert where instruments behave as though the rules have thinned, not broken exactly, but softened at the edges. These stories endure because they occur at the meeting point of two deep human needs: our trust in tools and our suspicion that the world still contains regions not fully translated into reason. In many cases, the causes are ordinary once examined closely. Mineral deposits distort local magnetic fields. Atmospheric conditions interfere with transmission. Topography bends signal paths in ways that seem mysterious until mapped with patience. What feels like anomaly may be nothing more than complexity meeting expectation. But that distinction matters less to the imagination than one might think. Even when the mechanism is natural, the experience of disorientation remains real. To lose faith in the instrument, even briefly, is to feel the ground shift beneath more than one's feet. That is why these sites attract both scientists and storytellers. Scientists arrive asking how conditions produce error. Storytellers arrive asking what error reveals about human certainty. Between them lies a shared recognition. Navigation is never only technical, it is emotional. We move through the world believing that direction can be fixed, that north will remain north, that the map will answer when we consult it. When that confidence falters, even for a moment, we are returned to an older state of being, one in which movement depends on intuition, caution, and trust that cannot be measured. Perhaps that is the hidden power of anomalous places. They remind us that knowledge is often a local achievement, not a universal guarantee. Our instruments are elegant extensions of perception, but they are still made within the limits of our understanding. Now and then, the world answers them with static, drift, or silence. And in that brief interruption, we are asked a question as old as travel itself. When the guide fails, what remains to orient us? Memory, instinct, community, or the courage to admit that we do not fully know where we are? What if the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that occur inside the body itself? Not the dramatic failures of illness we can name, but the quieter phenomena that move through medicine like unanswered notes. A patient wakes during surgery, yet cannot speak. Another develops abilities after injury that seem to arrive from nowhere. Someone reports seeing the room from above while hovering near death, describing details later verified by those present. None of these experiences easily fit the clean boundaries between brain, self, and consciousness that modern life prefers. Medicine is built on observation, repetition, and care. It has transformed human survival in ways that once would have seemed miraculous. But the body remains, even now, less like a machine than a living archive of systems layered beyond full understanding. Pain can exist without visible damage. Recovery can outrun prognosis. Memory can vanish and then return with a smell, a song, a flicker of light. The more closely we study the brain, the more astonishing it becomes that experience feels unified at all. This is where scientific caution becomes both necessary and incomplete. Extraordinary claims around consciousness often attract exaggeration, bad faith, or wishful thinking, and they should be tested rigorously. But skepticism can also become too narrow, dismissing lived experience because it does not yet fit prevailing models. That tension is especially sharp in medicine, where what cannot be fully explained still has to be cared for. A mystery in the clinic is not abstract. It belongs to a person, a family, a life interrupted by something real, even if its mechanism remains unclear. Perhaps that is why these stories persist with such emotional force. They touch the oldest uncertainty we carry. What exactly are we, beneath the language of diagnosis and anatomy? Flesh, electricity, memory, pattern, soul, or some braided form of all of them? The body keeps answering with both vulnerability and surprise. And maybe the lesson is not that science has failed, but that personhood itself may be wider than our current vocabulary. The unanswered question is not only how consciousness works, it is whether understanding it will require us to become more humble about what a human being is. It started with light trapped where light should not be. Deep in caves, beneath sea ice, at the edge of storms, researchers have documented forms of luminescence that seem to hover between chemistry and apparition. A glow moving across water without flame. A flash inside cloud without thunder. A pale radiance in the earth where no direct sun has reached for centuries. These events are not supernatural, yet they often feel that way at first encounter because they reveal how much of nature remains hidden in plain sight until the right conditions allow it to speak. Some of these mysteries eventually yield to patient explanation. Bioluminescent organisms turn shorelines into rivers of blue fire. Piezoelectric effects may help explain light released by stressed rock. Atmospheric electricity creates fleeting structures in the sky that earlier generations could only describe as omens. But understanding a mechanism does not erase wonder. In fact, it often deepens it. The world becomes more beautiful, not less, when we realize that darkness is full of systems waiting to ignite under pressure, movement, collision, or life itself. Still, not every luminous event settles neatly into consensus. The problem is often one of timing. Light appears suddenly, vanishes quickly, and leaves behind witnesses whose descriptions are shaped by fear, awe, and memory. Instruments may capture fragments, but not context. A glow on the horizon can be weather, geology, biology, or something stranger still. Science advances by narrowing possibilities, yet in these cases, the narrowing is often incomplete. The event passes before certainty arrives. Perhaps that is why unexplained light holds such power over the human imagination. It feels like revelation without translation, as though the world has opened a small window and then closed it before we could understand what we saw. We are drawn to brightness in darkness for reasons older than reason itself. Fire, stars, dawn, the lamp in a distant house. Light promises orientation, but these wandering illuminations offer something more difficult and more intimate. They remind us that not every source of illumination is there to guide us. Some lights exist only to show, for a moment, how large the surrounding darkness truly is. What if some mysteries endure not because evidence is absent, but because evidence arrives in forms we do not know how to trust? In archives, basements, hard drives, and forgotten notebooks, there are photographs, sensor logs, field reports, and testimonies that never become part of the accepted story. Not all deserve belief. Some are flawed, misread, even fabricated. But others occupy a harder category, neither verified nor dismissed, simply left in suspension because they do not fit cleanly within the channels that turn observation into recognized knowledge. This is one of the least dramatic and most human dimensions of the unknown. Discovery is not just about finding something. It is about convincing a community that what was found is real, relevant, and worth the cost of further attention. That process depends on method, but also on timing, status, language, and luck. A phenomenon described by the wrong witness can vanish. A result gathered with imperfect tools can be ignored even if it points towards something genuine. In that sense, the border between mystery and fact is not only empirical, it is social. Scientists know this, even when institutions prefer not to say it aloud. Research must be selective. Resources are finite. Careers are fragile. To chase an anomaly is often to risk being identified with it, so the unknown can become orphaned, not disproven, but unattended. It waits at the margins until better tools appear, or until a new generation asks a question the old one had learned to avoid. Sometimes that return leads to clarity. Sometimes it leads only to better uncertainty. And perhaps that is its own kind of progress. We often imagine truth as a door that swings open once and for all. More often, it behaves like light through fog, widening slowly, revealing shapes before names. What we ignore today may become obvious tomorrow, not because reality changed, but because our willingness to examine it did. The question then is not just which mysteries are real, it is which ones we have quietly trained ourselves not to see, and what that blindness costs a species built on curiosity. There is a moment in every mystery when the question stops being about the phenomenon and turns toward us, not what flashed in the sky, or what moved beneath the earth, or what signal crossed the dark, but why one person leans closer while another looks away. Curiosity is often spoken of as a virtue, yet in practice, it can feel like a risk. To ask the wrong question at the wrong time is to challenge not only ignorance, but comfort, hierarchy, and the fragile order built around what a culture agrees to call real. This is especially true when unexplained events gather communities around them. Witnesses compare notes. Amateur researchers preserve records that institutions overlook. Local memory keeps an incident alive long after official interest has faded. In these spaces, the unknown becomes more than an object of study. It becomes a shared human experience, shaped by trust, embarrassment, hope, and the longing not to have seen something alone. The mystery lives not only in the event, but in the network of people trying to decide what it meant. That effort is messy and often misunderstood. Crowds can exaggerate. Memory can drift. Stories can absorb details they did not originally contain. Yet collective attention also serves a purpose. It preserves anomalies long enough for future understanding to catch up. Many things once dismissed as rumor later entered science through persistence, pattern, and better tools. Not every strange report earns vindication, but some survive because ordinary people keep carrying the question forward when formal systems have already moved on. Maybe that is one of the quiet engines of knowledge. Not certainty, but refusal to let uncertainty be buried too quickly. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We gather around the unexplained, not only to solve it, but to protect the possibility that it matters. Somewhere between gullibility and dismissal lies a more difficult discipline, staying with a question without rushing to close it. And perhaps that is what these mysteries ask of us most deeply. Not belief, not denial, but the patience to remain honest in the presence of things that widen the edges of the world. What if the true subject of every unexplained phenomenon is time? Not simply the moment when something strange occurred, but the long afterlife that follows. A report is filed, a sample is stored, a witness grows older. Decades pass. Then someone returns to the case with new tools, fresh language, or a willingness the earlier era did not possess. Suddenly, the mystery changes shape. What was once dismissed becomes data. What seemed conclusive begins to look incomplete. Time does not merely bury questions, it edits them. This is one reason the unknown can feel so alive. It is not fixed. It moves with us. A phenomenon ignored in one century may become central in another because the surrounding culture has changed. New instruments reveal patterns older observers could never have measured. Fields once kept apart begin to overlap. Geology with acoustics, biology with electricity, psychology with neurology, astronomy with computation. The world has not become stranger. We have become differently equipped to notice how strange it always was. And yet every gain in understanding brings a humbling reversal. Each answer opens into new uncertainty. To identify the mechanism behind a rare light, a hidden signal, or an unusual behavior is not to exhaust its meaning. It is to place that event inside a larger web of questions about perception, error, complexity, and the limits of human models. The mystery does not vanish. It becomes more precise, and sometimes more profound. What we once feared as impossibility often matures into a deeper form of wonder. Perhaps that is the quiet promise held inside all unresolved things, not that they will one day confirm our fantasies, but that they will keep enlarging our methods, our language, and our patience. The unknown is not an enemy of knowledge. Often, it is the force that keeps knowledge from becoming complacent. We inherit unanswered questions from the past, and we pass our own forward in turn. The real mystery may be whether wisdom lies in solving everything or in learning how to live honorably beside what remains unresolved. It ends, or perhaps begins again, in the oldest place of all, the human mind standing before what it cannot fully explain. After the signals, the lights, the sounds, the scars in the earth, after the strange behaviors of animals, and the unanswered events within the body, what remains is not a catalogue of curiosities, but a portrait of a species in dialogue with uncertainty. We are meaning-seeking creatures living in a world that offers evidence unevenly. Sometimes it reveals itself in elegant patterns, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in a single moment that refuses to return. The temptation is always to choose comfort, to force every anomaly into belief or disbelief, to make mystery either sacred or ridiculous. But the deeper path is harder and more humane. It asks us to hold two truths at once, that rigor matters and that reality is often larger than the frameworks we use to measure it. This balance is not weakness, it is maturity. It is the discipline of saying, with honesty, that something happened, while also admitting we do not yet understand what it means. That discipline may be one of the most important forms of intelligence we possess, not the ability to conquer every unknown, but the capacity to remain thoughtful in its presence, to investigate without arrogance, to doubt without contempt, to listen without surrendering judgment. The unexplained, when approached carefully, becomes more than a puzzle. It becomes a mirror. It reflects our hopes, our fears, our institutions, and the stories we tell about what counts as real. And so the chapter closes with no final unveiling, no grand answer descending from the dark, only a quieter realization. The world has always exceeded our neatest descriptions, and perhaps it always will. That is not a failure of knowledge. It is the condition that keeps knowledge alive. In the end, the question is not whether every mystery will be solved. It is whether we can remain curious, ethical, and awake enough to meet the unknown without shrinking it to fit our fear. So we arrive at the far shore of the journey, not with a solved equation, but with a deeper kind of seeing. The phenomena we have followed were never only about anomalies in the sky, hidden signals, strange sounds, luminous seas, restless animals, or the uncertain frontiers of the body. They were also about the habits of human attention, about what we dismiss, what we protect, what we study, and what we quietly leave at the edge of acceptable thought until time, courage, or better tools invite us to look again. There is something profoundly human in that pattern. We build knowledge the way we build memory, selectively, imperfectly, with great care and unavoidable blind spots. Whole civilizations have vanished while believing their maps were complete. Whole eras have mistaken confidence for understanding. Yet history also offers another truth. Again and again, people return to the overlooked. A forgotten note in an archive, a witness finally taken seriously, a phenomenon re-examined by a new generation. And sometimes, in that return, the world becomes a little larger and the mind a little humbler. Perhaps that is the lasting value of mystery. Not that it promises hidden powers or dramatic revelations, but that it resists the laziness of certainty. It asks us to remain alert to complexity, to honor evidence without pretending evidence is always easy to interpret, and to remember that ignorance is not disgraceful unless we defend it as final. The unknown can frighten us, but it can also refine us. It can teach patience. It can teach proportion. It can teach reverence for reality as it is, not merely as we prefer it to be. And maybe that is where this story truly ends, with a question that belongs not only to science, but to every human life. When we stand before what we cannot fully explain, will we answer with ridicule, with fantasy, or with disciplined wonder? Our future may depend less on having every answer than on learning how to meet uncertainty with integrity. Because memory fades, tools fail, and theories change. But the need to look closely, listen carefully, and keep asking honest questions, that may be the most enduring knowledge we possess.